There is a particular kind of silence that settles over the Gulf of Aden just before 6 in the morning, when the water is still the color of pewter and the sky hasn't decided yet whether it belongs to the night or the day. This is Djibouti's quiet hour, the one window when the air doesn't feel like it's pressing down on your chest. Fishermen are already out past the reef. A mezzin's call drifts over rooftops the color of sand. And somewhere in the hills above the coast, a family is folding up bedding they dragged outside the night before. Because indoors, even after dark, the walls were still radiating the heat of the day like a stone that refuses to cool. This is a country most people couldn't find on a map. Wedged into a sliver of the Horn of Africa between Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia, facing one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth, where oil tankers and container ships pass in an almost constant distant procession. And it happens to sit inside one of the hottest, driest stretches of land anywhere on the planet. So the question this film sits with isn't really about geography or heat records. It's simpler than that, and stranger. What does it actually feel like to build an ordinary life, to raise children, fall in love, go to work, grow old in a place where the sun itself is the main character every single day? If that question pulls at you even a little, you're exactly who this channel is made for, so consider sticking around and subscribing. Because we go looking for these questions in the corners of the world most travel shows skip past entirely. And wherever you're watching this from tonight, whatever your own climate looks like outside your window right now, drop it in the comments, because I'm always curious how far the extremes really stretch, from where you are to where we're headed today. Djibouti is small. You could tuck the entire country inside a mid-sized American state and still have room left over. And yet inside that compact footprint, it holds an almost absurd variety of terrain. There's a slender coastal strip along the Gulf of Aden and the Gulf of Tadjoura, where the capital city breathes in salt air off the Red Sea's southern mouth. Move inland and the land buckles and cracks. This is part of the East African Rift, a place where the African and Arabian tectonic plates are slowly, patiently tearing themselves apart, millimeter by millimeter over millions of years. That single fact explains almost everything strange and beautiful about Djibouti's landscape. It explains Lake Assal, a salt lake sitting in the country's interior that ranks among the saltiest bodies of water on the planet. Its basin dropping low enough to make it the lowest point on the entire African continent. Its shoreline crusted in blinding white salt formations that afar caravans have crossed for generations, hauling slabs of salt by camel the same way their ancestors did. It explains the otherworldly limestone chimneys of Lake Ab, venting steam from the geothermal restlessness beneath the desert floor. A landscape so alien it looks lifted from another planet. And it explains why, in the north and west, the land suddenly lifts into highlands like the Goda Mountains, where the temperature can drop low enough at night that you'd actually want a blanket, a detail that surprises almost everyone who assumes the whole country is simply one flat furnace. Further out from the capital, the desert asserts itself even more plainly. The Grand Bara, a vast, cracked plain of hard-packed earth stretching toward the southern border, looks almost lunar in its emptiness, and it draws a small but growing stream of adventure travelers for its wide-open expanses, ideal for wind-driven sports across sand instead of water. Not far away, the Day Forest National Park climbs into cooler, greener highlands. A surprising pocket of forest clinging to elevation where birdwatchers come looking for species found nowhere else nearby, including the Djibouti francolin, a small ground-dwelling bird found only in this one patch of highland forest and nowhere else on Earth. And just off the coast, Mocha Island and its neighboring islets offer some of the calmest, clearest diving water in the region. A short boat ride from a capital that, from its rooftops, looks like nothing but heat and concrete. This is part of what makes Djibouti so disorienting to actually visit. Within a single day's drive, you can move from a coral reef to a salt desert to a mountain forest, all of it folded into a country roughly the size of a small American state. But make no mistake, heat is the organizing force here. Along the coast where the capital and most of the population live, the hot season runs roughly from May through September, and daytime temperatures routinely climb past 40 degrees Celsius, well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with the interior deserts running hotter still. In the Danakil region to the north, shared with Ethiopia and Eritrea, temperatures can push past 50 degrees Celsius, making it one of the most punishing environments where people still choose, deliberately, to live and work. A dry wind known locally as the Khamsin sweeps through in the hottest months, the kind of wind that doesn't cool you down so much as remind you it has teeth. Rain, when it comes at all, arrives in a brief and unreliable window around October to December, sometimes falling so lightly it barely registers, other times arriving in sudden violent bursts that can flood a dry riverbed in minutes. Annual rainfall across most of the country rarely climbs past a few inches for the entire year. This isn't a place with seasons in the way a temperate country understands them. Djiboutians will half joke that there are really only two, hot and hotter. And yet, none of this reads on the ground as some empty wasteland. The coastline curves around the Gulf of Tadjoura, ringed by the Goda Mountains, and its waters are extraordinarily alive home to coral reefs, seagrass meadows, and one of the most reliable places on the planet to swim alongside whale sharks, the largest fish in the ocean, which gather here between roughly October and February to feed on plankton blooms in the Gulf's nutrient-rich currents. Fishing villages line these shores, their boats pulled up on volcanic black sand each evening, nets mended by hand the way they've always been. This is a country defined by extremes sitting almost uncomfortably close together: salt flats and coral reefs, desert plains and mountain forest, tectonic violence and unhurried fishing villages, all packed into a landmass smaller than many single American counties. Step into an ordinary Djiboutian home, and the entire architecture of daily life reveals itself as a negotiation with the sun. Thick walls, small windows, shaded courtyards, these aren't aesthetic choices, they're survival choices, refined over generations of trial and error in a climate that punishes anything built carelessly. In Djibouti City, where roughly 3/4 of the country's population lives, homes range from modest concrete block houses in older, densely packed neighborhoods to newer apartment blocks that increasingly depend on air conditioning to make the hottest months bearable at all, a dependence that comes with a real cost. Because electricity here is expensive, and a household running air conditioning through the hot season can watch its power bill climb into the hundreds of dollars a month. Away from the capital, especially among Afar and Somali Isa communities who still hold on to pastoralist traditions, you'll find the traditional Dabita or Ari dome-shaped nomadic dwellings, built from bent branches and woven mats, portable, breathable, engineered over centuries to shed heat rather than trap it, and designed to be dismantled and carried onward when a family follows its herds of camels, goats, and sheep to the next patch of grazing land. Because that nomadic rhythm hasn't disappeared, even as most of the country has settled into towns and cities. A meaningful share of Djiboutians still live a pastoralist life, moving with camels, goats, and sheep across some of the driest terrain on earth, reading the land for water and pasture the way a sailor reads weather. For these families, a good year isn't measured in income but in rainfall, and a single failed rainy season can mean walking herds much farther than usual in search of grazing that hasn't dried out. It's a life that has grown harder in recent decades, as droughts have become more frequent and less predictable, pushing more families to give up herding altogether and move toward the capital in search of steadier work, one of the quiet forces behind Djibouti City's rapid growth into a place now home to the overwhelming majority of the country's population. That instinct moving with the environment instead of fighting it head-on quietly shapes even city life. Djiboutians don't try to defeat the heat through sheer willpower. They move with it. The working day often starts early, sometimes before 6, when the air is at its most forgiving. Markets are busiest in the cool hours of morning, stalls piled with fish hauled in at dawn. Sacks of rice and spices, bundles of fresh produce trucked in mostly from Ethiopia, since Djibouti's own arid soil leaves little room for large-scale farming. Midday, as the heat climbs toward its punishing peak, the pace of the city visibly slows. Shops shutter, streets empty, and people retreat indoors or into shaded courtyards to wait it out. Life resumes again as the sun drops toward the horizon, when the Corniche waterfront fills with families walking, children playing, fishing boats returning with the day's catch silhouetted against the evening light. Food in Djibouti tells the story of everywhere this small country has ever touched. Centuries of trade across the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden layered Somali, Afar, Yemeni, French, and even South Asian influence onto Djiboutian tables, and the result is a cuisine that feels like a crossroads because, quite literally, it is one. The closest thing to a national dish is skautakaris, a fragrant one-pot dish of rice slow cooked in a richly spiced lamb stew, seasoned with cardamom, cumin, and cloves, traditionally centerpiece of celebrations like Eid al-Adha, though you'll find versions of it any day of the week in the capital. Alongside it, almost every meal, you'll find laksouks, a spongy, slightly sour flatbread cooked until its surface blooms with tiny characteristic holes. The same family of bread known elsewhere in the region as injera or laho, eaten with honey and butter for breakfast or torn apart to scoop up a stew at dinner. Fa-fa, a warmly spiced soup built around goat or camel meat and vegetables, shows up especially in the south of the country, while sambusas, the region's answer to the samosa, appear as street food and party food alike. For something sweet, there's salwo, a dense, fragrant halva made for weddings and holidays, and small banana fritters dusted in sugar, sold hot from roadside stalls in the evening. Along the coast, grilled Yemeni-style fish, split open and cooked whole over open flame, counts as a genuine local delicacy. A reminder of how much this cuisine still leans on the sea just across the strait, in Yemen, as much as on the African interior behind it. Meals are halal, consumed communally, and often built to be shared from a single large platter rather than individual plates. Eating here is rarely a solitary act. And then there is Khat, the one custom no honest film about daily life in Djibouti can leave out, because it genuinely shapes the rhythm of the afternoon for an enormous share of the population, mostly men. Khat is a leafy stimulant plant, imported daily and fresh mostly from the highlands of Ethiopia, chewed slowly over hours in a specific kind of social gathering, traditionally held in a space called a mabraz, where friends, neighbors, and colleagues sit together, talk, argue politics, tell stories, and pass the afternoon in a slow communal haze. It's a practice woven so deeply into daily social life that entire business hours across the country quietly bend around it. Offices and shops often wind down by early afternoon, once the day's cat arrives on the flight or truck from Ethiopia and the gathering begins. It's not a fringe habit. Surveys and researchers describe it as something close to a near-universal part of male social life here, even as it draws real concern for the hours and household income it consumes. We'll come back to that. because it belongs as much in the honest column of this story as in the cultural one. If you're finding this kind of unfiltered, researched look at how people actually live worth your time, this is a good moment to hit subscribe. Because we're only about halfway through what makes Djibouti one of the most genuinely singular places on the map. What holds Djiboutian identity together more than any single word or custom is a shared inheritance from two peoples, the Somali Isa, who make up roughly 60% of the population and are concentrated mostly in the south and around the capital, and the Afar, roughly a third of the population, traditionally spread across the north and west. Both are Cushitic-speaking peoples with a nomadic pastoralist heritage that stretches back long before any European power set foot on this coast. And both were among the earliest peoples in Africa to adopt Islam, which today is practiced by the overwhelming majority of Djiboutians and threads through daily rhythms. From the 5 calls to prayer that structure the day to the shared fast of Ramadan to the celebrations of Eid. French and Arabic are the official languages, a legacy of nearly a century under French colonial rule as French Somaliland before independence arrived on the 27th of June 1977, a date now celebrated every year as National Day, with dance and music filling towns and villages across the country. But walk the streets and it's Somali and Afar you'll actually hear most, alongside Arabic in religious and commercial life, and French in schools, government offices, and courts. A linguistic layering that means many Djiboutians move fluidly between 3 or 4 languages before lunchtime. That layering shows up everywhere in Djibouti City, a capital where the population is so concentrated that it feels almost like a single organism absorbing the entire country's energy. Walk through its central markets and you'll pass spice stalls fragrant with cardamom and saffron beside stands selling French bread. Men in traditional Somali sarongs sharing sidewalk space with patrons at French-style cafes. Women in bright wraps balancing baskets on their heads with an ease that comes only from lifelong practice. This isn't a manufactured tourist tableau, it's simply what happens when a port city has sat at the hinge between Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and the wider trading world for as long as anyone can remember. Long before Djibouti was Djibouti, this stretch of coast sat within the sphere of the Adal Sultanate, a powerful Somali Afar Muslim state that dominated the Horn of Africa from roughly the 13th through the 16th centuries, controlling trade routes running from the interior highlands of Ethiopia down to the Red Sea. European interest arrived far later, and by the late 19th century, France had established a colonial foothold here, eventually formalizing it as French Somaliland and, later, the French territory of the Afars and Isas, names that themselves trace the shifting relationship between the two founding peoples and their colonial administrators. Independence in 1977 didn't erase that inheritance so much as fold it into a new national identity, one still visibly shaped by the deep history of this coast as a crossing point rather than a destination in itself. The years that followed independence weren't without hardship, either. A civil conflict in the early 1990s, along with waves of refugees fleeing instability in neighboring countries and a punishing drought, put real strain on the young nation's economy and infrastructure. A period many older Djiboutians still remember clearly, and that shaped the cautious, relationship-driven way business and politics still tend to operate here today. Art here leans heavily on oral tradition rather than the visual poetry, in particular, holds a place of genuine cultural weight. Traditionally, skilled reciters known as gabaye would travel from village to village, carrying news, history, and community memory in verse, at a time when writing was far less common than speaking. Dance remains central too, especially during celebrations like Independence Day, when villages across the country stage performances that blend movement passed down through generations with the exuberance of a modern national holiday. Music draws from Somali and Afar traditions alongside Arabic influence and, increasingly, French and international sounds, layering old rhythms with new ones in a way that mirrors the country's whole identity. If there's one thread that runs under nearly everything in Djiboutian daily life, it's resilience shaped by scarcity, the accumulated practical wisdom of communities who have spent centuries learning to survive in a landscape that offers very little water and even less patience for carelessness. You see it in how people build. You see it in how the working day bends around the worst of the heat instead of pretending the heat isn't there. You see it in a culture where hospitality remains a genuinely serious value. Offering water, tea, or a seat in the shade to a stranger isn't performative here. It's closer to an unwritten obligation. Rooted in a nomadic past where a traveler denied shelter in the wrong stretch of desert could die of it. Djiboutians are frequently described by outsiders as unusually warm and welcoming people, and that warmth doesn't read as an accident of temperament. It reads like a survival skill that outlived the conditions that first demanded it, and simply became who people are. Now for the part of this story that matters just as much as the landscapes in the food. Because a fair picture of any country has to hold its difficulties honestly, without exaggeration and without looking away. Djibouti's economy is a genuine paradox. This is a country with almost no arable land, very few natural resources, and barely any large-scale industry. And yet it has built one of the more strategically important economies in the entire region by leaning entirely into geography. Its port complex handles the overwhelming majority of trade for landlocked Ethiopia, a country of roughly 100 million people next door. And that single function alone generates the majority of Djibouti's public revenue. On top of that, Djibouti hosts foreign military bases from multiple nations including France, the United States, Japan, Italy, and China, whose base here, opened in 2017, was its first ever overseas military installation, and the rent these nations pay for that access is a meaningful and steady stream of income for the government. Recent economic growth has actually been strong by regional standards, running in the range of 6 to 7% a year, driven largely by the port's expansion and its role as a transshipment hub amid disruptions elsewhere in Red Sea shipping routes. Underpinning all of it is a currency, the Djiboutian franc, pegged to the US dollar at a fixed rate that has held since 1973. Giving the economy a rare kind of monetary stability for a country in this part of the world, even as the underlying debt picture remains fragile. But that growth has not translated evenly into everyday prosperity. Djibouti carries a substantial external debt burden, much of it owed to China, and international observers have flagged that debt load as a genuine long-term risk. Unemployment remains stubbornly high, and a significant share of the population continues to live below the poverty line, even as glossy new port infrastructure and foreign investment reshape the capital's skyline. It's a dualistic economy in the truest sense, a modern revenue-generating sector built around trade, logistics, and military rent, coexisting alongside a much larger informal economy where day-to-day life remains a genuine struggle for a great many families. Djibouti ranks toward the lower end of global development indexes, sitting well down the United Nations Human Development Index despite its comparatively high GDP per capita for the region, a sobering statistic sitting right alongside the headline growth numbers. To its credit, the government has historically been more effective than many of its neighbors at actually collecting the tax revenue owed to it, which has helped fund infrastructure most of the region can only aspire to. But that infrastructure, concentrated heavily around the port and the capital, hasn't yet translated into broad-based job creation. A gap between the country's geopolitical importance and the everyday reality of many of its citizens that anyone reporting honestly on this country has to sit with rather than smooth over. Cost of living compounds the difficulty because nearly everything beyond fish and goat meat is imported, and imported goods in a small, arid country carry a heavy premium. Rent in Djibouti City runs surprisingly high for the region. A modest one-bedroom apartment can run well over $1,000 a month, and a comfortable, secure home suitable for a family with international standards can easily run 2 to 3 times that. Electricity is expensive, and given how much air conditioning is genuinely required to survive the hot season without misery, monthly utility bills can climb into hundreds of dollars on their own. Water is scarcer still. Djibouti has no permanent rivers and no natural freshwater lakes, and renewable water resources per person here rank among the lowest anywhere on Earth. What water does reach households increasingly comes from desalination plants along the coast and, more recently, a pipeline carrying water in from Ethiopia's highlands. Remarkable feats of infrastructure that exist purely because the alternative, going without, isn't an option in a country this dry. Drought remains an ongoing threat rather than a historical footnote. In the drought that peaked around 2022, roughly a sixth of the entire population was affected. A reminder of just how thin the margin for error really is here, and one of the reasons water piped in from desalination or from across the Ethiopian border costs noticeably more here than in most neighboring countries. Then there's CAT, circling back to where we left it earlier. It's legal, deeply embedded socially, and for many Djiboutian men, it structures a genuinely large portion of the day. But it also comes at a real cost. Imported daily, it draws a meaningful share of household income away from other needs. And the hours spent in the afternoon mabras are hours not spent working, studying, or with family in other ways. It isn't framed here as a moral failing of individuals. It's simply one of the honest costs woven into the texture of daily life, alongside the heat. The water scarcity and the economic imbalance, the kind of detail a country wouldn't choose to put in its own tourism brochure, but one that anyone actually living there would recognize instantly as true. Healthcare, too, has real limits. Facilities in the capital can manage everyday medical needs reasonably well, but anything serious typically means travel abroad, often to Nairobi or Paris. An option only realistically available to those with resources or employer support. For the expatriates, aid workers, and military personnel who do choose to build a temporary life here, the adjustments run deeper than the heat, and the price tags a slower pace of bureaucracy, a business culture built on patience and personal relationships rather than speed. Internet infrastructure that lags behind much of the wider region, and a language landscape where English, unless you're inside an international organization, gets you only so far. So, could you actually live here? It's worth sitting with that question honestly rather than answering it for you. Djibouti asks something specific of anyone who calls it home, not just tolerance for heat that would flatten most people within a week, but a willingness to restructure your entire relationship with time itself. To let the sun decide when the day starts and stops. To accept scarcity as a permanent condition to be managed rather than a temporary inconvenience to be solved. It asks you to find rhythm inside limitation, the way its people have for generations, moving with camels across a landscape offering almost nothing, and somehow building not just survival out of it, but genuine warmth, generous hospitality, layered food, poetry passed mouth to mouth across centuries, and a national character strangers consistently describe as kind. And maybe that's the real story underneath all the numbers and the geography, not that people merely endure conditions this extreme, but that an entire culture organized itself so completely around respecting its environment instead of fighting it, that scarcity itself became the shape of the culture's greatest strength. You see it in the caravans still crossing the salt flats at Lake Assal by camel, in the fishermen still reading the tides the way their grandfathers did, in a hospitality so instinctive it barely registers as a choice anymore. There's something worth sitting with in that, long after the numbers about temperature records and rainfall totals fade from memory. Djibouti doesn't perform ease for anyone watching. It doesn't soften itself for the camera, and it doesn't need to. It simply keeps going, morning after brutal, beautiful morning, the way it always has. If a place like this small, difficult, and quietly remarkable is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and stay close. Because there's a whole world of countries out there living lives nothing like the one outside your own window. And we're only just getting started uncovering them.